Tech by Tips.
Welcome to another Tech by Tips video. In today's video we're going to be covering an open source tool that is available out there, especially if you're interested in working with DevOps or if you're a software engineer and kind of want to be able to create your applications and deploy them yourself. And this is definitely a tool that is very beneficial for everyone, especially in tech, because it allows you to run a Kubernetes cluster without having to go through all the overhead of setting up machines, etc., to build a cluster. So that's what we're talking about here. It's the application named Kind. So let me go quickly into what Kubernetes is and how it runs. So basically, let's look at this diagram here. When you're creating a Kubernetes cluster, you have a set of machines. It could be actual computers, servers, or it could be virtual machines. And each one of those machines has a different role in this cluster, right? You're grouping a bunch of machines together so that you can utilize those resources better. One machine out of those, at minimum, in high availability clusters, you're going to have more than one, but that would be a machine that contains what is called as the control plane, which is all the set of tools and applications that control how the Kubernetes cluster works, how it orchestrates and stores information about it. So all of that belongs into the master node. But then you could also have worker nodes. So in worker nodes, those are machines that don't control the cluster per se, but they perform work for that cluster. And they have less components than the master nodes do. But the pods that contain those containers that you're deploying are going to be deployed in those machines. So if you try to create a cluster, you could, in theory, create a cluster that has one master and no slaves, and then you would also deploy your containers into that master node. But ideally and more normally in companies that are using Kubernetes for running their workloads, you're going to have more than one machine. So that means that you have to build those machines, install the underlying operating system. Usually Kubernetes tends to be run in Linux, so some kind of Linux that you have to configure in the machines, and you have to do the configuration management of that operating system, and then you have to install the Kubernetes platform on top of the operating system, right? Then you have to identify which one's going to be the master node, which ones are going to be the worker nodes. You have to make sure that they have connectivity there among themselves, etc. So there's a lot of overhead for you to start working on a Kubernetes cluster. But that's the benefit that Kind brings us. Kind is kind of an inception of containers. So you're running containers inside containers. So you're building a cluster in a bunch of containers in your machine. So it's pretending like you have several machines in a cluster. So it's really nice. It's very simple for you to set up a Kubernetes cluster to deploy your application to test things, or maybe if you're working on the application and you want to work on the code while the application is live so you can kind of see what goes on there. That's perfect for languages that are interpreted instead of compiled. For example, PHP and Python is a good case. So you could just build your cluster, deploy your application there, make changes to your application, and see how the changes immediately take form. It allows you also to be working with a system that matches exactly what you're going to be using when you deploy your application, because you're building a container image that is going to have the exact same capabilities and resources and packages in there. So that's even better. You don't have to worry about, working on an environment and then when you're going to deploy it, it behaves differently. So Kind is a very, very nice tool for this. And in this short video, I wanted to kind of cover that, an introduction into what Kind is and how you can get it, and basically how you can deploy your own Kind cluster. So the first thing that we should know here is that for us to use Kind, we need to have either Docker or Podman or something similar to actually deploy those containers in. If you're using a Windows machine, it's more than likely that you're going to have to install then Docker Desktop. So you can go into docker.com, download Docker Desktop and install it. Once you have your Docker Desktop running, then you can go ahead and retrieve the file for Kind. So we need to go and get the binary, the executable for Kind. So we can go here really quickly into our quick start, and the quick start in their website has a section here that talks about how to install that from their releases. In this case, they have a set of instructions for Linux, for Mac OS, and in Windows. but these instructions are relying on PowerShell to basically retrieve the executable, put it somewhere, and then it should be able to be used. In my case, I'm going to make it even simpler. I have already done this before, so I have a folder named DevOps in my C drive, and that's where I put my DevOps executables. So I'm going to do what I did when I got this kind file. So basically, I looked for this URL here in the command that they give you here, and I just decided to go to that, and it'll open in my browser, and then I could just tell it where I wanted to download. So I just renamed this to kind, and I removed all the other stuff, and I saved it like that in here, and that's how I got my kind.exe file. Then once I have that in a folder in my computer, I just want to make sure that I have it accessible in my command prompt or my PowerShell window whenever I open it. So for that, I go into my Windows and I type environment here, and I'm gonna look for this thing that says edit system environment variables, and I click on that. And then it brings me to this window. In here, I'm going to click on where it says environment variables, and it opens up this other window. And in here, I'm going to look for this thing that says system variables path, and I double click that. And what I did is I just added an entry by clicking new that points to that folder where I put my kind executable. So once I do that and I click OK, and OK again, and OK, then now my kind executable is part of my path in my Windows machine. So that means that whenever I open a command prompt window, for example, I can basically call that executable and it should respond. So if I say kind and then I say version, it is able to actually execute that command because it knows where kind is in my computer. So from now on, I can run kind commands in my computer. Now, I want to point something out. Even though I have kind already recognized and everything, if I do not have Docker running, kind is not going to behave properly. So let's go, for example, into the website and look at a command that we're going to be running, which is kind create cluster. You can say it like that, or you can actually specify a name for that cluster. So let's do this and try to create a cluster without having our Docker running. So let's say the name is kind cluster, and then it says failed to create the cluster, failed to list the nodes, command docker ps, return an error. And that means that I was not running Docker, so it cannot run if I don't have Docker. So for that, let's go and start Docker desktop, and then we should be able to successfully run that command and create our kind cluster. So let's give it a little bit of time for Docker to set up. Okay, it says the engine is running. So now we could, in theory, go back, execute the same command, and then we should get kind executing the creation of a cluster named kind cluster inside my machine. And as you can see, it's pulling images that it needs to create those containers that represent a node, and then it prepares the actual nodes for this cluster, and then it writes a configuration file, and then it starts the control plane, which is part of the Kubernetes system. So let's validate now that it is working as it says. So we can say kubectl get nodes, and here we go. We have our kind cluster control plane, which is basically the master node. So currently my cluster is only a one node cluster, but it doesn't matter. You can still use this for development on your own system. And if you want to go into a more realistic approach to testing things, then you can tell kind to create a cluster that has more than one node. So first, let's go ahead and run the command that was suggested here to see details about this cluster. kubectl cluster info, and then the context is the kind cluster. And it tells me that I have a control plane that is running on the local IP, and it's telling me the core DNS is running there too. Nothing more, but with the kubectl get nodes, we saw that it was only one node in the cluster. So now let's say that we don't want this, so we could basically get rid of this cluster. So if we run the command with delete instead of create, that should get rid of that cluster that we have created. So it deleted the nodes, so we can validate that by checking to see if we still see those nodes. And when we do a kubectl get nodes, then we cannot find anything because we got rid of that cluster. So let's say that I want to create a cluster that has more than one node. In that case, first I have to go into my location here that I'm going to be running the command from. Let's say I'm going to run it from DevOps. So I'm currently in the C drive. Let's go into DevOps. Perfect. And in this folder here, I'm going to create a file, and that's going to be a YAML file. And in this YAML file, we are going to put some information that we need to tell kind what I want my cluster to look like. So if I write this, I'm basically saying I want my cluster to have 3 nodes, and out of those 3 nodes, I want one of those nodes to be a master node, and the other 2 nodes are going to be worker nodes. So I'm going to define that the kind that I'm defining with this YAML is a cluster, and I'm using the kind API version, and I'm saying that the nodes that are defining are 3 of those, and one of those is a control plane, and the other 2 are worker nodes. So that's all that I need to put here in this YAML file. And now I should be able to just go back, since I'm already in this location where I see that cluster YAML file, and I could just run the following command. I can say kind create cluster, and then I can say config, and then I just pass the name of that file that I created that I believe was cluster YAML, correct? And then I can give it a name also to the cluster like we did before. And now this time I'm going to name it my cluster. So now when we run this command, this is telling kind, look at this configuration file that I created, and when you're creating my cluster named my cluster, make sure that you build it just as I described it in this YAML file. So let's run this command, and we see that it's again making sure that we have the image. Oh, that's something that I didn't mention before. Let's wait until this finishes and then I'll cover that. So it's preparing the nodes, writing the configuration, starting the Kubernetes control plane, installing the CNI and the storage class and all of that, joining the worker nodes. So it already had the master ready, and now it's joining those workers to the master so the master can manage those. And they have been joined, and it looks like everything is ready now. And here's what I wanted to show before. If we go into Docker, we'll see that we have the my cluster completely visible within Docker because our cluster is running in containers inside Docker desktop. And as you can see, it has the name of the cluster that I chose. So it says my cluster. And we have the master node here, and the worker 2 and the worker 1. And if you see, the image that we're using for this is the kind node image. So it's really nice that we are able to build a Kubernetes cluster based on containers entirely. So now we can go ahead and run this command again to see what information do we get about the cluster. kubectl cluster info context kind my cluster. Oh, and that's another thing that I want to point out. I can run the kubectl commands because I already have downloaded kubectl in my system and I have it accessible. And as we can see, it says, we have our control plane, we have the core DNS, but we don't really get a lot of details. So I'm going to do a kubectl get nodes, and then we see that our new cluster that is named my cluster has a master node, which is the control plane, and 2 worker nodes here. We now have a multi-node cluster. So this is a really good tool for anyone to learn how to use, especially because it's going to make your life a lot easier. It's going to help you develop your applications in a system that behaves exactly like where you're going to deploy it, and it doesn't compromise any other systems. You wouldn't be surprised at how many times I've seen people, developers, and like even in big companies, even when I work with Dell, this is a problem that I constantly saw where, for example, we had a bunch of different data centers around the world, and some of them were production, some of them were test and development, and many times people, instead of creating their own cluster in their own machine to build whatever they're building and testing it, they would just mess with the clusters that are live running for the company, and sometimes they would just completely take down the clusters with everything that was running in there. So that's really a bad practice. Using kind and a tool like this is really good, is really professional, because it makes sure that you cannot negatively affect other people while you're working. So I really recommend that you learn how to use kind. It is a great tool. It doesn't need a lot. If you're developing, definitely this is going to be your best friend. It's going to make you rely less on people to get things working for you, and it's going to allow you to work on things that are always going to be configured properly with what you need for your systems. So that's it. This video's already gone too long for what I wanted to cover here. I hope you liked it. I hope you found it useful. If you're interested, definitely go to the Kind website. There's a lot of good information there. And remember, if you like the content, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel if you have not done so, and leave in the comment section below anything that you would like to see me cover, anything that interests you, and I'll be helping you out as much as I can. If it's something simple, I'll reply to you on the messages, and if it's something that I think is worth covering in a video, I'll definitely work on creating a video for you. And remember, I'm not monetizing this channel. You should not be seeing ads on my videos. I rely entirely on your support, so if you like the content, please support me. There's links in the description below for PayPal donation, and there's also a Bitcoin address where you can donate